What's going on, everybody? This is Blade55555, and today I'm presenting to you a new YouTube series called Road to Improving. And as you'll notice in the title of this video, we're going to be starting at the 1K ELO range, which is about where everyone starts when beginning the game. My goal for these videos is to go over how to improve, like what you should focus on at a certain ELO. So if you're 1K, I'm going to give you specific pointers on what you should focus on. And then we're going to go to 1100, 1200, all the way to 1600, where the tips will be kind of different for the most part. Some will probably be the same at the beginning, between 1000 and 1100. But in general, that's going to be the general uh, theme of these videos, is to try to show you what you should focus on to become a better player, or if you're stuck in a certain ELO range, what you might not be realizing that you need to do. So in this game, I had a couple people give me their uh, usernames so I could look at some of their 1v1 replays, and I think this is a perfect example of a good game to demonstrate what these players should work on and what you should work on if you're stuck at 1000. So the first thing I'm going to say is you should focus on one civilization and one build order. The reason being is when starting out, typically at 1000 ELO, it's a lot to try to, if you're switching civilizations all the time, you're going to make a lot more mistakes because you're trying to learn too much. And that's a kind of a big thing when it comes to RTS games, is I actually go over this in another video on how to improve at RTS games. That goes over the general tips that I give to new players when trying to improve. And one of the main tips I give in there is if you try to learn too much, you're not going to learn much at all. You're just going to slow yourself down. I always recommend focusing on a couple of major things when improving. And so at this range, I would recommend picking one civilization, one build order, and you stick to that until you can do it pretty much without thinking, where it's just second knowledge, like it's just like I can't think of the word right now, but it's just common. You just know how to do it, you don't have to think about it. Then you can start adding in new build orders and all that fun stuff. So in this game, in specifics, is there was a lot of idle town center timing, and as you can see, these are just small mistakes, but they all add up. Is the sheep wasn't completely under the town center, so he's all the way out here gathering. Um, you don't need 5 on gold. The gold was just a little late in getting here. And you can just kind of see the build order isn't super refined here. A good way to start with HRE, Holy Roman Empire, is putting 4 on food and the first 2 villagers on gold. So you start with 6 villagers, first 4 to food, next 2 to gold. And then you rally until about 6 on food, you inspire, and then you kind of swap this around from food to gold. And you only need, like I said, 2 or 3 on gold. At the very beginning, you'll be able to advance just fine. And then looking at our Delhi opponent, we're going to notice some other pretty big mistakes from them, as well as how unrefined their build order is they're advancing, but they don't have a mosque. So they have none of that tech coming in, and that's very important for Delhi. But again, the point of this video is to show what to kind of improve on, and not to go over that specific, especially in these games. But those are just kind of examples. 7 to advance here is too much. One of the big things I noticed when watching this game is idle town center time, which is what I expected going into this series. Especially at this lower range, idle town center time is going to be very common. One thing that you want to get into the habit of doing, and probably your number one focus when starting out, is making villagers. Queue these bad boys up. You use all this food and queue those villagers up. You should always have villagers in the queue. As you saw, our player here was floating 150 food and just now queued 3 villagers. So a major focus at this range is going to be villager production. Hotkey your town center, do whatever you need to do to focus on this, and just always make a villager. Make that your priority. That's one of the biggest problems at this lower ELO range, is not constantly doing that. And it is important, because if you skip villagers, you're slowing down you're slowing down your next advancement, or unit production, or just so on. It slows you down a lot, because as you'll notice, we're 5 minutes into the game and they're at 16 villagers. And you know what? I don't actually know what villager count they're supposed to be at, but I do know they've had plenty of idle town center time, so we'll just go with that. But as we can see, our Delhi player here has a mosque, hasn't started any of his upgrades, and he's about to be in feudal. Um, and he's got 8 on wood, which is actually pretty normal. You do want a good amount on wood when advancing. And then, yeah, so as we can see here, we're in feudal age right now. We have an idle scout doing nothing. We have a scout out here. And the interesting thing about this game is both players made scouts very randomly from their town centers. If you're going to go multiple scout opening, you want to do it at the very beginning, like because that's where you get the most benefit to get extra sheep and to scout more of the map earlier. Adding it after making a few villagers is not very useful because typically the sheep will have all been taken, and I mean unless you really just want to you're worried about something like a rush or something, then you'll want to add a second later, I guess. But typically you do it at the very beginning. And so to kind of go on point here is you'll notice we're at 6 minutes and our HRE player is just now adding a stable. Uh, they should have been able to add this stable a long time ago. They were advanced by about 5 or so minutes. If your plan is to go stable, you want to get it as soon as you advance or at least shortly after because we're not seeing a second TC. The goal is clearly not to go fast castle, otherwise you would have less on wood. And we're floating quite a bit of gold, but that's all right, because typically you want to have that gold just when you're ready to advance the castle. And then if we look at our Delhi opponent, we're going to see something kind of similar. We're seeing 630 in the game, 800 food, only one villager queued here, and 200 wood, but we're not really making any units. Now they are, but they have 3 in a queue and a huge bank. This is another major thing to focus on as a player stuck in the 1K ELO range is your resources. Spending them is very, very crucial to improving. You don't want to float resources for no reason. If you're advancing, obviously you need to save resources to advance. But if you're planning on being aggressive or your opponent's rushing you, um, that amount of resources it'll cost you games because imagine if this player decided they're going to do an archer all in and so they come across the map with 12 archers and you're floating 900 food 500 wood. You're going to take damage that shouldn't happen because you weren't making units and you just let your resources build for no reason at all, which comes to my second portion of spending your resources. You don't typically want to make units for no reason. And what do I mean by that? I mean making units and then just having them stay still, not doing anything. Like not taking map control, not harassing your opponent. You're just making units to make units. That's another kind of thing that can be a big mistake. Typically at the higher ELO range, that's when it's going to be really, really prevalent. But even in lower ELO, if you're making units for no reason, not planning to attack, and your opponent's not attacking you or not planning to attack you, you're just wasting resources that you could use to advance faster or get some tech up in general. But as you can see here, our HRE player is just now kind of getting his barracks down. They've been floating a lot of wood and food, and they're kind of making units very randomly. And again, idle town center time. We're at 27 villagers at 830. I'm pretty sure they should be much higher than that. And then our Delhi player is at 29 villagers, and they've kind of been doing the same thing. But look how much wood they have. They have 500 wood, 1 production building each. They never got their upgrades. Still no mosque upgrades. And then they made a blacksmith and still haven't started any blacksmith upgrades. So one of the general things to improve on in here is definitely your resource management and not forgetting to kind of get these upgrades. If you're playing a civ like Delhi, your upgrades are very important. And as we can see, our red player here kind of forgot. They're making units and they're not really doing much. He's not trying to harass with these. They're just kind of chilling here, which is just, again, it's a big mistake. You want to be active with your units if possible. And then the other thing is you want to come into your whole game. You want to go into a game with a plan. Let's say as HRE, you're typically the HRE player wants to get the castle to get the relics. So your focus should be to learn that build order to get fast castle or semi-fast castle and grab the relics and then go into, say, siege or knights or something like that. You want to think about that kind of stuff. And then you'll kind of see that our H3 player kind of moved across the map, has no idea what his opponent was doing, and lost his army because of it. This is also another common problem at this range is you don't know when to attack, or you attack when you're not supposed to. Uh, for example, as we can see, blue can advance right now. They can go castle. They have the resources for castle, so there's no reason to attack when you're advancing. If you're going to go up in age, your goal should be to keep your army back because then you can benefit from castle age upgrades. Veteran horsemen, veteran archers, or adding crossbows, adding siege, all that stuff. Attacking while you're advancing or before you're about to advance is a huge mistake. Even players at the higher level play. I mean, even I still sometimes make this mistake, but it's a lot more common here. If you're going to attack your opponent, think to yourself, why? Like for example, if you're going to advance, why would you attack? What benefit do you get from attacking? If your opponent's not advancing, there's a good chance they're going to have a bigger army than you since you spent your resources aging up to castle. So the only benefit you're hoping for is that your opponent is either aging and doesn't have an army, or your opponent is just not doing anything and you get lucky. So always think of that. If you're going to attack your opponent, think why. Why should I attack right now? In this situation, you shouldn't because you're trying to advance. And then one thing is, and this happens even at high level play, as again, we're at almost 1,000 wood. You have 13 on wood right now, the Delhi player. There's no reason for this. If you see yourself floating resources, do not be afraid to make a market. Again, this is even at high level play, but at this level, if you're floating 1,000 wood, throw down a market, take some villagers off of wood, and put them either on gold or food. Whatever resource you need at the time. It's very dependent on what resource you need or what your plan is. If you're trying to get the castle, then you want to pull, all these villagers or most of these villagers off of wood, put them on gold so that you can advance the castle age. And then as we can see with our HRE opponent, they've lost their army, or opponent player, they've lost their army twice or taken a lot more damage than they should have, and they've advanced the castle. So they finally hit castle, and now they're attacking. Um, Again, there's no reason to attack. You want to get your castle age technologies and then attack. At this point, there's no reason to. So like I've said a couple times already, always come in with a plan and try to. And obviously, you do still need to adapt. Like there's no doubt if you see your opponent is, if you scout your opponent, let's say they're going 2 town centers, no military buildings, going castle, and you have these production buildings out, you have units out, you should want to punish that. Or stick to your game plan if you're planning on going castle yourself. But you do still want to adapt with your units, but the main focus that you want to work on at this level of play, make villagers, spend your resources. Do not float them just because you can. Imagine if instead of advancing the castle, for example, imagine if you just pumped all your resources into units and then attacked. Delhi player would have died here because they're floating a ton of resources. They only have 1 production building, well, I mean 2 technically, a stable and a barracks, no upgrades, and they don't have the efficient production to allow them to pump units out really quickly. If you spend your resources and attack in feudal age, this opponent's going to lose the game because of it. Because he just doesn't have the production to make a ton of units. And then alternatively, if our HRE player decided to never attack during this game and go straight to castle, he can grab these 3 relics. And as we can see, he's actually did a good job of going there with his prelates. Put them in here, add in siege, and then you can do a big siege timing attack. Because even if the Delhi player goes castle right now, Delhi doesn't have the gold income or they have to make a siege workshop and then get their siege, which you can already have done. As you can see, that we have 400 wood, so we can throw it on a siege workshop, to spend some of that wood. This relic gold is going to kick in really quickly once you get it in here, and then you'll probably just win the game that way. So as you can see, a lot of these things at this level of play are indecisiveness and not knowing when to just kind of advance or when to attack. So that's kind of what you want to focus on. Now, I am going to go over another game as well where I kind of show some more common, just to kind of show what I'm talking about when it comes to these mistakes. And then, well, I'll summarize at the end as well. And here's our second game here between Firebrick and Blue. I'm just going to say Blue. Now this is going to be at the higher end of 1,000. This was about 1,080, I think, is the ELO here, so close to 1,100, but it's still in that range I want to go about between 1,000 and 1,100. And we're going to go skip. We're going to be fast forwarding through parts of this, but I just kind of want to demonstrate again some common mistakes at all levels of play between the 1,000 that I just want to pinpoint here. So this is a Abbasid Dynasty versus Rus, and we'll just kind of kick right into it. Already this they're kind of following a build order here that we can see that Blue is doing here. You know, 7 on food for berries, build a house, build this, and start gathering gold. A very common opening for Abbasid nowadays. They also opened up double scout because Rus has a bounty system that they want to work on, or that they want to deny. So very, you know, this is actually a pretty solid opening. No huge mistakes here that are worth discussing. And our Rus player is kind of doing the same thing, not really making any giant mistakes. So nothing to really critique or talk about here. But this is going to be kind of an example of what you want to do at this level of play, especially is constant villager production and following a solid build order. It's so important. It'll really help you a lot. You'll be surprised that once you kind of master those few basic skills, you're going to shoot up quite a bit in the rating system, because a lot of players don't work on that or don't realize that that's what they're failing and think they're losing because of something else. So we're just going to keep watching this. Not too much to go over, just kind of very basics. But again, as we can see, I mean, they're actually doing a pretty good job of keeping the villager queue, but as we're also going to see here in a second, they almost had idle town center time, which I know it's weird for me to say. You're like, well, they didn't though. But you'll be surprised how when you push it up to last minute, you're going to miss villager cycles when doing that. And then we can see our red player has a solid plan. Blue loses a scout. Not going to critique that too much because those kind of mistakes are common, especially, you know, probably until like 13, 1400, I would assume. Don't know for sure. But as we can see, our Abbasid player here, you know, they're kind of struggling a little bit. They have a lot of gold. They haven't started this fresh food stuff. So this is kind of where they're deviating or making the mistakes that most players make at this level, is not following the build order or not executing the build order properly. They forgot fresh foodstuffs, which for those people who aren't aware, this makes villagers cost 50% less. So you're paying 25 food a villager instead of 50. And then you'll also see that they gathered 300 gold. If your goal is to get wheelbarrow and this, you need, I think it's 150 plus 125. Yeah, so you need 275 gold total. Typically what you're going to do, you're going to start wheelbarrow, you're going to get this the second you age up, and then you start going for stone once you have 275 gold. As we can see, our player here is making 2 stables. It's floating a lot more gold than they need to be, and they're very late on their stone because of it. So they're not getting that second town center, which is a pretty big factor. And then so to kind of go into this further, as we can kind of see from our Rusa player, they're making a pretty big mistake they have no one on food right now. They have a ton of villagers queued. They house themselves, and they have this very random lumber camp. I would like to ask them why. It would be kind of an interesting question, but that's really irrelevant to this kind of discussion here. But this is kind of a good example of not following a build order, kind of like our blue player did here a little bit, where they made some mistakes. But I'd say red's mistakes are a lot bigger. They queued a lot of villagers. They made 2 archery ranges, and they haven't made a single archer. And this is a kind of a general theme that happens a lot. Players will make these buildings, but then they don't utilize them to any degree. which then begs the question, why make these? Why not instead use that villager time to either gather more food or gold or whatever you're trying to do. These are just kind of wasted resources that could have been spent elsewhere. And then we see our, they got the 400 wood. They only have 4 on stone. This is kind of another thing is they typically want to have more on stone when you're going for that second TC, especially if you're trying to do it quickly. Just to kind of give you guys a perspective of this build order that Blue did is you can have the second TC building when going fast wheelbarrow plus fresh foodstuffs. You should be able to start that second town center at 6 minutes. They're at 8 minutes. That's a lot of villagers they're missing. So just to kind of let's do some math here. It takes 20 seconds to build a villager, right? That's 6 villagers they're missing out on. So instead of being at 28 villagers, they could be at 34 villagers right now because they're 2 minutes late on that town center. They haven't even started building it. They have 4 horsemen, but they're not moving out with them. This is, again, another common mistake. They're making units, but they're not doing anything with it. They're just kind of chilling. Typically, you want to saving for 2 or 3 is not a bad idea. 1 horseman isn't really going to do much damage. You save for 2 to 3 and then you move out. Try to harass the food or poke into the wood line. I had to pause the video because my dog was barking. Okay, so now we're going to kind of start out. Again, they're moving out finally to do some harassment, but I also want to go some other big things that a lot of players miss is spending their resources. This is the second major tip I would give to players is spending the resources and not worrying about micro. A lot of players will see, like making these horsemen and harassing. It's great. It's fantastic. But they're also floating a lot of wood, which is not what you want to do when you could spend, have those resources somewhere else or using a market to sell some of it for gold to maybe advance faster and then swapping them to food to get that castle age quickly. But yeah, spending the resources is probably the number 2 most important thing, and this alone will help you jump up in the ranks and beat players you were having trouble with. If you can consistently spend your resources on a unit composition, it doesn't matter if your opponent has 5 archers to your 20 spears. 20 spears is going to beat 5 archers every time. And if your opponent is microing with those 5 archers back and forth while you're just making 20 spears, A moving, and then looking at your base and say making more production or making sure you're continuously making units, then you're happy with that because your opponent microing is time they're not spending at their base. So one thing I would really recommend is not spending time microing your units or microing in general, but focusing your effort on spending the resources. It doesn't matter what your opponent has, make this a habit of yours until you get comfortable with it. Spend the resources, make a bunch of units, highlight your units, A move across the map. Don't even worry about watching the fight, and then go back and make sure that you're continuously making units, your villagers are working, you don't have any idle villager time, you're not going to get yourself housed, and so forth. That skill alone will probably get you to 1300 ELO if you master spending your resources. And instead of microing. And then once you get comfortable with spending your resources, making the units necessary, that's when you can start adding in the micro that it's more fun to do. It's fun to manage your army, and when you get to an engagement between archer spear versus knight archer or knight spear or whatever, and you win, it feels good because you out microed your opponent. That is a pretty micro intensive compositions. Both are when faced against each other. And as you can see from our red player here, they're actually keeping their resources, at a pretty fairly low. I mean, they're floating some food now, quite a bit of food, but they're still doing a decent job because they're focused on microing. But as you can see, this is kind of an example I'm talking about, is red is focused on microing, their food is going up high, their town center is idle, they're not making a single villager, they're not making any military units, all because they're focused on microing their horse archers. This is an exact example of wanting to talk about when microing should not be your focus at this level of play. If you watch a high level player micro, you'll notice they're not just microing. They'll micro, but they don't have idle town center time. They typically don't have idle barracks, archery ranges unless they don't have the resources. They're always doing both. So yes, red player wins this fight but they neglected their economy. They've had idles for a long time. And again, they haven't made a single unit the whole time they were microing that fight. And if we look at blue, they're floating a lot of resources, but he made a mangonel. He has only 2 idle villagers, now 0, well, now 10. He's made a lot of production, a little overkill in the production. There's really you're not going to be able to sustain this with this economy, but it's still an example of spending their resources, right? They spent all their wood on these. They're making a ton of archers, and red is just now still idle town center time. And if we look at blue, he's the same thing actually. He's not making any villagers. Again, this is very, very crucial at this level of play. 57 villagers at 17 minutes into the game. They should be at, I think it's 70 to 80 by now. And then red's at 40 villagers. So there's only a 17 villager difference, even though blue's been on 2 town centers a lot longer uh, than red. And red's been on 1 town center with idle town center time. So it just kind of shows the example that blue should be a lot further than 17 villagers ahead right now. But they are spending their resources. They're making a ton of units. And then red's resources are, he's spending his resources, but again, he only has 2 archery ranges, 2 barracks. He's finally making a bunch of villagers, and he's making nothing else. They should be able to afford more than 2 archery ranges of horse archers. If your plan is to go horse archers, you can get to fast castle and have 4 archery ranges pumping horse archers immediately. You should be able to afford more than 2. This is going to go to an example of why red's most likely going to lose this game, though, is blue is pumping out units. Look at his military here. He's got 41 military, and if we look at red, he's got 11. And he's queuing up units. If you ever see yourself queuing up units and you're getting many rows of units, that's another sign that you need more production buildings. That's when you should think to yourself, okay, if I'm queuing 3 horse archers or 3 archers and in 2 stables, 3 in each, that means you can afford 4 archery ranges to spam out units. So that's when you should be like, oh, I should make more archery ranges so I can make it more than that unit rather than wait longer. These take 22 seconds to build. So instead of getting 4 every 22 seconds, you're only getting 2. And that adds up. Imagine, you could have 8 horse archers right now instead of 4. Just as a kind of example. So this is where blue did a good job of noticing they were floating resources. And even though this is inefficient, it's still better to do this than what red is doing, where he just has the 2 and refuses to make any more and is floating resources and not being able to make much of an army at once. So even though this is inefficient, it's still better and will get you more wins than this where you have 2. Imagine if red had a really good, imagine if they had their 31 villagers on wood, maybe 16 or more on food. They would have a lot of food, a lot of wood, no military, because they aren't making archery ranges. And then we're going to kind of fast forward now through the rest of this. There's not too much else to go over. We kind of hit those major points. You're going to see here that blue is just going to stomp over red just because he has so many more units that it doesn't really matter what he does because of that. Red's only at 76 supply, floating a bunch of wood and gold, no food, and he has no way to really counteract this army. But then as you can see here, what our blue player is doing is he's not making units while fighting. So imagine if blue did this. Imagine if he selected these units, attack moved across here, and then started making units behind it. I mean, he can almost go Imperial Age with this, but if he just kept making units, he could be at 200 rallying units across the map instead of worrying about his army movement. And then as you get higher again, that's when the micro comes in, because you don't really need to worry about micro when you have a bunch of resources and you can just A-move your opponent. But either way, as you can see, it doesn't really matter because blue's now still making some units, which is good, and red just doesn't have anything to do it. And so we're going to kind of end it there. Nothing else to go over. We understand that hopefully this helps you out and understand some of the big things you should focus on. Just kind of as a summary of what you need to focus on. Constant villager production. Play one civilization and follow a build order. And make sure to follow it to a T if you can until you can do it without even thinking and spending your resources. Those would be the four things I would work on at 1K ELO. Don't worry about unit micro. Don't even worry too much about the unit compositions, even though that's still important. At this level of play, you can beat your counters by just outmassing your opponent because you're just spending all your resources. You get those down, and I promise you will see the results. You will see yourself jump up in skill, and you'll also see that you'll go up a lot in the ELO rating. And then with that, that's going to end our session for the 1000 ELO. Our next video will be counting on going over the 1100, and then we'll go to 1200. And like I said, my plan is to go all the way to 1600. Hopefully you enjoyed. Hopefully this helps you. If you have any questions or comments, please comment on the video and I will respond. If you have any tips or something else you want to see, let me know and I'll take that into account. Thanks again and peace out, everyone.